The sun had not yet touched the Pennsylvania skyline when I felt the weight of the envelope under my pillow. It was heavy with a promise that felt like oxygen after 18 years of holding my breath. My grandmother had handed me $100,000 for college on my 18th birthday. By the next morning, my parents were already demanding it to settle my brother's mounting debts. My refusal was the final fracture. I gripped my car keys until the metal bit into my palm. Downstairs, the floorboards groaned under my father's heavy, rhythmic pacing. The kitchen light spilled across the lawn in a cold, clinical rectangle. I watched from the shadows of the landing as my mother folded her hands on the table, her face a mask of practiced tragedy. They weren't mourning my childhood. They were calculating the cost of my defiance. Beside them, Julian sat slumped in a chair, his eyes glued to a phone screen. Indifferent to the storm he had invited into our house. He smelled like expensive cologne and desperation. I retreated into my room and moved with the silent precision of a ghost. I shoved 3 pairs of jeans and my laptop into a faded backpack, avoiding the closet door that always creaked. Every heartbeat sounded like a hammer against my ribs. I reached under the mattress to retrieve my Social Security card. But the plastic sleeve was gone. My breath hitched. They had already been in here while I showered. They were stripping away my identity before I could even use it to walk out the door. A sudden sharp rap on my bedroom door made me freeze mid-motion. "Annabelle, open up," my father commanded, his voice a low vibration that bypassed my ears and rattled my teeth. "We know you're awake. Don't make this more difficult than it needs to be." I didn't answer. I slid my backpack on and stepped toward the window, the old glass rattling in the frame. The drop to the porch roof was steep, but the thought of staying in that room felt like a slow, certain death. I swung my legs over the sill, the cold morning air stinging my cheeks. The shingles were slick with dew, catching the faint, gray light of dawn. I scrambled down the slope, my sneakers scuffing against the grit, until my feet hit the railing. Below me, my old sedan sat at the end of the driveway, a getaway car for a girl with no destination. As I jumped to the grass, the porch light flickered on behind me. Someone had heard the impact. The front door handle began to turn. I dove into the driver's seat and fumbled the key into the ignition. The engine turned over with a violent roar that shattered the silence of the neighborhood. In the rearview mirror, my mother appeared on the porch, her arms crossed in a gesture of icy disappointment rather than fear. She didn't scream for me to come back. She simply watched, her silhouette framed by the amber glow of the hallway. I shifted into reverse and accelerated. My phone buzzed on the passenger seat, with the first of 1,000 angry notifications. The tires screamed against the asphalt as I swung the car onto the main road. My knuckles were white, locked tight around the steering wheel. Every headlight in the mirror looked like my father's predatory SUV. I reached for my phone, but the screen was a chaotic waterfall of texts. "Coward," one from Julian Reed. "Thief," my father wrote. The betrayal tasted like copper in my mouth. I needed miles between me and that house. I drove until the city lights faded. Rain began to smear the windshield in long, jagged streaks. I pulled into a rest stop, the engine ticking as it cooled. My hands were finally shaking. I reached into the glove box for a map, but my fingers brushed a small, cream-colored envelope instead. It was addressed to me in my grandmother's elegant, looping script. My heart hammered against my ribs as I tore it open. Inside was a spare key and a handwritten address in a quiet Massachusetts town. The note was short and cryptic. "They will look where you want to go, not where you are safe." I stared at the key, its brass surface cold against my skin. Grandma Eleanor had anticipated this. She knew my parents would view my future as a communal asset. She had built me a back door out of their cage long before I realized I was trapped. I put the car in gear. I wasn't just running anymore. I was heading toward an alley. By dawn, the landscape had shifted into rolling hills and gray stone walls. I found the house at the end of a long, gravel driveway. It smelled of wet pine and ancient wood. Eleanor was already standing on the porch, wrapped in a thick wool cardigan. She didn't look surprised to see my battered car. She held a steaming mug of coffee and watched me with a gaze that felt like a shield. "You made it," she said simply. I stepped out of the car, my legs feeling like lead. I wanted to cry, but the air was too crisp for tears. "They took my social security card," I whispered, my voice cracking. Eleanor didn't flinch. She just beckoned me inside the warm hallway. "They took a piece of paper. Annabelle, I have your backup documents and the rest." We sat at her heavy oak table. She pushed a thick, black folder toward me. It was stuffed with bank statements and legal documents I didn't recognize. I flipped through the pages, my eyes widening at the numbers. They were records of every cent my parents had drained from my grandmother over the last decade. Julian's failed startups, my father's bad investments, and my mother's hidden shopping debts were all there. Eleanor had been keeping receipts for years. This wasn't just a ledger, it was a roadmap of their greed. "I stopped giving them money last year," she said. "That is why they are so desperate." A sharp vibration from the table made us both jump. My phone was lit up with a video call from my mother. I didn't want to answer, but Eleanor nodded toward the device. "Let them see where you are," she whispered. I swiped the screen, and my mother's face appeared, distorted by rage. Behind her, I could see the familiar walls of my bedroom. My father was holding my high school diploma over a lit candle. "Come home, or this burns." I stared at the screen, my heart freezing as the flame licked the edge of the parchment. My father's eyes were hollow, devoid of the warmth he usually faked for the neighbors. "It is just paper," I said, my voice surprisingly flat. He didn't flinch. Instead, he moved the candle closer to the center of the seal. My mother leaned into the frame, her face tight. "This is about respect, Annabelle. You have betrayed your own blood for a check." The connection flickered as a tear rolled down my mother's cheek. It was a weapon she had used for years to keep me compliant. "Julian is in real trouble this time," she pleaded. "They are coming for the house if we don't settle his accounts by Friday." I looked at Eleanor, who remained perfectly still beside me. The silence in the kitchen was heavy with the weight of decades of lies. My parents weren't saving a son. They were hiding a scandal. "Let it burn," I whispered. And I watched my father's expression shift from triumph to pure shock. He dropped the candle, the flame extinguishing on the rug. He hadn't expected me to call his bluff. I realized then that their power only existed if I agreed to participate in their theater. I ended the call before he could find his voice. The screen went black, reflecting my tired, haunted face. I was finished being their fallback plan. Eleanor reached over and took my phone, sliding it across the oak table. "They will be here by sunset," she stated calmly. "They know this is the only place you would run." I looked at the black folder again, seeing the sheer volume of their theft. They had treated my grandmother like a bottomless well. Now that the well was dry, they were coming for the last bucket of water I held. I needed to prepare for a siege. We spent the afternoon moving with a grim, shared purpose. Eleanor showed me how to engage the heavy iron bolts on the back doors. We closed the heavy velvet curtains, plunging the house into a protective, amber gloom. My grandmother wasn't afraid, she was expectant. She moved with a strange, calculated grace that suggested she had been waiting for this day. She checked the security camera feed on her tablet. A dark SUV had just turned onto the gravel. The engine growl outside was low and familiar. I recognized the distinct rattle of my father's muffler. They didn't knock at first. They simply stood on the porch, their shadows stretching long across the frosted glass of the front door. I could hear Julian's voice, sharp and whiny, complaining about the drive. He sounded like a child who had been denied a toy. My mother started to sob loudly, her voice echoing through the wood. It was time. I stood behind the door, my hand hovering over the lock. My stomach twisted, but my mind was unusually clear. I wasn't the girl who had climbed out the window anymore. I was a woman holding a folder that could dismantle their entire world. A heavy fist slammed against the door, making the frame shudder. "Open the door, Eleanor," my father roared. "We know she is in there." Then, the handle began to turn with a violent, metallic click. The lock rattled under the force of my father's frustration. I leaned my weight against the solid oak, feeling the vibration of his anger through the wood. "We are not leaving without that check, Annabelle," he shouted. His voice was raw, stripped of its usual middle-class poise. I looked at Eleanor, who sat calmly with her tea. She didn't look like a victim. She looked like a judge waiting for the court to assemble in her foyer. I turned the deadbolt slowly, letting the metal screech. The door swung open just 6 inches before the security chain caught. My father's face appeared in the gap, flushed and sweating despite the Massachusetts chill. Behind him, Julian looked pale, his eyes darting toward the gravel driveway, as if expecting a debt collector to materialize. My mother was silent now, her eyes red, rimmed and hollow. They looked like a family of ghosts haunting their own lost future. "Give us the money, and we can forget this happened," my father whispered. He tried to soften his expression, but his eyes remained hard as flint. I gripped the edge of the door, my knuckles aching. "The money is for my tuition, Dad. It was never yours to spend." Julian stepped forward, his lip curling into a sneer. "You don't even have a major yet. I have people who will break my legs." His honesty was a chilling admission. The power balance shifted when Eleanor stood up. She walked to the door with the black folder, held tight against her chest. "He is right about one thing, Annabelle," she said, her voice cutting through the tension. My father's face lit up with a brief, pathetic hope. He thought she was finally taking his side. But then she slid a single sheet of paper through the gap. It was a formal notice of eviction for their own house. My mother gasped, snatching the paper from the air. Her hands shook as she read, the legal headers and the signature at the bottom. Eleanor had bought their mortgage months ago through a holding company. She hadn't just been watching their downfall, she had been subsidizing it to gain total control. My father's jaw dropped as the realization hit him. They weren't here to rob me. They were here because they were already completely broke and homeless. "You wouldn't throw your own daughter onto the street." My mother sobbed. She looked at Eleanor with a mix of terror and loathing. Eleanor didn't blink. "I am not throwing her out. I am holding her accountable." She looked at my father, who was now leaning against the porch railing for support. The man who had tried to burn my diploma was suddenly very small. The silence that followed was thick with the scent of damp earth and failure. I realized then that the $100,000 was just a distraction. The real battle was for the ground they stood on. My father looked at me, his eyes pleading for a mercy he had never shown. "Please, Annabelle, talk to her." I looked at the folder in Eleanor's hand, and then at the car keys in my pocket. I reached out and slowly unhooked the security chain. A new car had just pulled into the drive. The sedan that pulled in behind my father's SUV was nondescript and charcoal gray. 2 men in dark suits stepped out, their movements synchronized and professional. My father straightened his posture, trying to reclaim some shred of his former authority. "Who are they?" my mother asked, her voice trembling. The air turned brittle as the men approached the porch. They didn't look like family friends or debt collectors. They carried the heavy, silent weight of the legal system. One man held out a gold badge while the other clutched a stack of blue folders. "Julian Vance," the taller one asked, his voice a flat monotone. My brother tried to shrink behind our mother, but there was nowhere to hide. The men were investigators from the state's Financial Crimes Division. I looked at Eleanor, who was still standing by the door with her tea. She didn't look surprised. She looked like she had made the phone call herself. "This is a mistake?" My father stammered, stepping between the agents and his son. "My son is a businessman. He's had some bad luck, that's all." The agent didn't blink. "He's a person of interest in a series of fraudulent loan applications." He looked directly at Julian, who was now visibly shaking. My parents had spent years smoothing over his mistakes, but they couldn't smooth over a felony. The facade of the perfect Pennsylvania family was finally collapsing. The second agent turned to my father. "We also have questions about the signatures on your grandmother's property transfers." My mother's hand flew to her mouth. I felt a cold surge of realization. They hadn't just been begging Eleanor for money. They had been forging her name to strip her assets. The black folder on the table wasn't just a ledger of greed. It was a collection of evidence for a criminal trial. They were trapped on her porch. I stepped back into the foyer, the distance between me and my parents feeling like a canyon. "Is this why you needed my 100,000? I asked. My father didn't look at me. He was watching the handcuffs being pulled from an agent's belt. They hadn't wanted to pay Julian's debts to save him. They wanted to pay them to stop the investigation before it reached their own signatures. My inheritance was supposed to be their hush money. Eleanor stepped forward and finally opened the door wide. "The documents you seek are in the office," she told the agents. She didn't look at her son, in-law, or her daughter. She looked through them as if they were already gone. Julian let out a pathetic, stifled sob as the metal cuffs clicked shut around his wrists. My mother collapsed onto the porch swing, her head in her hands. The suburban dream had officially become a legal nightmare. The agents led Julian toward their car, his expensive shoes scuffing the gravel he used to mock. My father turned back to me, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated hatred. "I hope you're happy, Annabelle. You destroyed this family over a check." I gripped the folder tight and looked him in the eye. "No, Dad. You destroyed it. I just stopped paying for the wreckage." As they left, a second SUV appeared at the gate. The second SUV was white with a local sheriff's decal on the door. It parked unevenly, blocking my father's path to his own vehicle. A deputy stepped out, squinting against the harsh morning glare that now exposed every crack in our family facade. My father stood frozen on the lawn, his hands trembling as he realized the exit was sealed. The agents had Julian, but the local law was here for the house. My mother remained on the porch swing, staring at nothing. I walked back into the kitchen where Eleanor was methodically rinsing her teacup. The clink of ceramic against the porcelain sink was the only sound in the room. "The second car is here," I whispered, my heart still racing from the sight of the handcuffs. She didn't look up, her movements calm and deliberate. She had choreographed this entire morning with the precision of a master architect. She wasn't just defending me. She was finally cauterizing a wound that had bled for years. "They think I am the villain," I said, leaning against the cold granite counter. I felt the weight of the $100,000 check in my pocket like a stone. Eleanor dried her hands on a linen cloth and finally met my eyes. Villains are often just people who refuse to play their assigned roles, Annabelle." She gestured toward the window where the deputy was speaking to my father. The power was gone. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him. Outside, the deputy held up a clipboard with a bright yellow carbon copy attached to it. My father tried to gesture toward the house, his voice rising in a desperate, final plea. "This is a family matter," he shouted, but the deputy just shook his head. They were being served with a formal restraining order and a notice of immediate forfeiture. Eleanor, had used their own forged documents to prove they were unfit to hold the title to anything. I watched through the glass as my mother finally stood up from the swing. She walked to the edge of the porch and looked toward the window where I stood. For a second, I saw the woman who used to tuck me in at night. Then her face twisted into a snarl of pure resentment. She didn't blame Julian for the fraud, or my father for the theft. She blamed me for being the one who survived. It was a terrifying realization. The deputy walked my parents toward their SUV, his hand resting lightly on his belt. They were being escorted off the property, forbidden from returning until a court date was set. My father turned back one last time, his eyes searching the windows for me. He looked like he wanted to scream, but the presence of the law kept him silent. They climbed into the vehicle, their movements slow and defeated. The gravel crunched as they finally backed away. Silence reclaimed the house, but it was a heavy, expectant kind of quiet. I sat at the table and pulled the check out of my pocket. It looked so ordinary for something that had caused so much destruction. "What happens now?" I asked, looking at the black folder that held their secrets. Eleanor sat across from me, her expression soft but resolute. "Now, you decide what your life is worth without their shadows." She pushed a laptop toward me. I opened the lid to find an admissions portal, already pulled up on the screen. It was the university I had dreamed of attending since I was 10 years old. The application was complete, waiting only for my final confirmation and the tuition deposit. My hand hovered over the trackpad, my fingers shaking. This was the moment of no return. If I clicked, the bridge back to my old life would burn to ashes. I didn't hesitate for long. I clicked the button, and the screen flashed with a green checkmark. The confirmation email arrived a second later. A digital herald of my new reality. I felt a strange lightness in my chest, as if a physical weight had been lifted from my lungs. I was no longer the backup child, or the hidden bank account. I was a student with a future that belonged entirely to me. I looked at Eleanor and saw her smiling for the first time. The twist came when the doorbell rang again, soft and persistent this time. I walked to the door, expecting another officer or a lingering investigator. Instead, a delivery driver stood there holding a large, expensive floral arrangement. The card was addressed to me. But the handwriting wasn't my parents'. I opened it to find a single sentence that made my blood run cold. "Julian told us where the rest is." It was signed by the debt collectors. I dropped the card as if the paper were glowing with heat. The white lilies in the vase smelled like a funeral parlor. I looked at Eleanor, who was already standing by the window, her hand hovering over the alarm keypad. The flowers were a signal, a calling card from the sharks Julian had tried to feed with my future. He told them about the 100,000. I whispered. The money wasn't a secret anymore. It was a target on my back. Eleanor didn't panic, but she moved with a new, sharp urgency. She reached into a drawer and pulled out a burner phone I had never seen before. "Julian was always the weakest link in their chain," she said, her voice like grinding stone. She began typing a message with steady fingers. I realized that my brother's arrest hadn't ended the danger. It had merely shifted the debt to the only family member who still had liquid assets. We were being watched. I looked back at the flowers and noticed a small, black device nestled deep within the stems. It was a GPS tracker, its red light blinking like a rhythmic, malevolent heartbeat. My stomach turned over. They didn't just want the money, they wanted to make sure I didn't move it. I reached out to grab the vase, but Eleanor caught my wrist. "Don't touch it," she warned. "Let them think we haven't noticed. We need the time." We retreated to the basement, a space filled with the scent of cedar and old books. Eleanor pulled back a heavy rug to reveal a floor safe flush with the concrete. "Your grandmother was never just a baker of fruit pies, Annabelle," she muttered. She spun the dial with practiced ease. Inside were stacks of bound documents and a secondary passport. She was prepared for a total collapse. I felt a surge of adrenaline. This was my irreversible moment of decision. I need to move the funds now, I said, opening my laptop on a dusty workbench. My fingers flew across the keys as I logged into the high-security portal Eleanor had set up. The $100,000 sat there. A digital number representing my entire escape plan. I initiated a series of rapid transfers to offshore accounts Eleanor provided. Each click felt like a heavy door locking behind me. I was cutting the last thread that tied my wealth to my name. The power in the basement suddenly flickered and died, plunging us into absolute, suffocating darkness. My heart hammered against my ribs as I heard the distinct sound of glass shattering upstairs. They weren't waiting for a polite negotiation anymore. The shadows outside had decided to collect in person. I felt Eleanor's hand find mine in the dark. Her grip surprisingly strong. "Stay behind me," she whispered. We began to climb the stairs, our breathing the only sound in the gloom. We reached the kitchen just as a flashlight beam swept across the ceiling. 3 figures were silhouetted against the frosted glass of the back door. They weren't wearing suits like the investigators. These men wore heavy jackets and carried crowbars. I felt a cold, hard resolve settle over me. I wasn't the invisible girl from Pennsylvania anymore. I picked up a heavy iron skillet from the stove. It was a primitive weapon, but it felt solid and real in my hand. "We know the money is gone," I yelled into the dark, my voice echoing off the tile. The flashlight beam snapped down, blinding me for a split second. "We moved it 10 minutes ago." One of the men laughed, a low, wet sound that made my skin crawl. "Accounts can be recovered, girl. Fingerprints and faces are harder to replace." They stepped into the room, the smell of rain and cheap tobacco following them like a lingering cloud. Eleanor stepped into the light, holding the burner phone high like a torch. "The police are already 3 minutes away," she stated. I triggered the silent alarm the moment the tracker entered this house. The lead man hesitated, his crowbar dipping slightly toward the floor. He looked at the phone and then at the shadows. He knew the risks of a federal investigation. For a moment, the air was thick with the possibility of extreme, sudden violence. They retreated as quickly as they had arrived, disappearing into the gray morning mist. I slumped against the counter, the iron skillet slipping from my numb fingers. We had won the encounter, but the peace felt fragile and temporary. I looked at the black screen of my laptop. The transfer's now complete. My money was safe, but my location was compromised. Then, I saw a new notification on my phone. It was a text from an unknown number. "Check the basement safe again." I stared at the unknown message, my thumb hovering over the glass. The air in the kitchen was thick with the copper scent of adrenaline. I turned back toward the basement stairs, my legs moving before my mind could protest. Eleanor followed, her flashlight cutting a clean arc through the lingering dust. We reached the concrete floor and knelt by the open safe. My hands shook as I reached past the documents. My fingers brushed something cold, metallic, and entirely unexpected. I pulled out a small, leather-bound ledger tucked into a hidden side pocket. It wasn't full of bank numbers or property deeds. Instead, it contained handwritten dates and names of people I recognized from my childhood. These were the high society friends my parents had cultivated for decades. Beside each name was a dollar amount and a specific, dark secret used as collateral. My grandmother hadn't just been saving money. She had been collecting the leverage required to keep my parents at bay forever. The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. My parents were not just incompetent, they were blackmailers. This ledger was the real reason they were so terrified of Eleanor. I flipped to the final page and saw my own name written in red ink. Underneath it was a single sentence. "Her freedom is already paid in full." I looked at Eleanor, who was watching me with a sad, knowing smile. The lie of my unworthiness finally shattered into dust. I stood up and realized the power was back on. The hum of the refrigerator upstairs sounded like a victory march. I didn't need the $100,000 to be free. I had been free the moment I walked out that Pennsylvania door. I walked to the furnace and tossed the ledger into the small, flickering pilot light. The secrets of my parents' past curled into black ash. I was done carrying their history. I was done being their collateral. We walked back to the porch and watched the sunrise break over the Massachusetts hills. The light was pale gold, stretching across the gravel where the invaders had stood. My phone buzzed one last time. It was an automated notification from the university. My housing assignment was confirmed. I was going to live in a room with a view of the quad. I took a deep breath of the cold, clean air. The knot in my chest had simply vanished. Eleanor leaned against the railing, her eyes fixed on the horizon. "What will you do first?" she asked. I thought about the textbooks I would buy and the classes I would take. I thought about a life where no one demanded my future to pay for their past. "I think I will just be Annabelle," I replied. I reached into my pocket and felt the folded slip of paper. Even though the actual funds were now securely in the offshore accounts Eleanor provided, this physical remnant was a reminder of the choice I had made. Then, I noticed a black car idling at the gate. It was the same charcoal sedan from the investigators. They weren't here for more money. They were here to collect the final signatures for the criminal testimony. The cycle was finally broken. The cycle was finally broken.